Hello, learners. Welcome to the 42nd lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. In the previous lecture, I described how this idea of a powerful, commodifying, uh, dehumanizing gaze has been theorized by quite a few thinkers and how it shapes a great deal of writing and thinking about gender and race in the 20th century. And how, even though these writers and their works may not be cited directly in Bessie Head's writing, they lend a very powerful interpretive frame for understanding what's going on in a question of power. I ended by reflecting a little bit on the work of Frantz Fanon, and specifically the chapter, The Fact of Blackness, from Black Skin, White Masks, and how there's this very visceral moment in which Fanon describes the white gaze, or the powerful way in which a white supremacist or an anti-black society views blackness, and how the victim of that is not just physical violence or segregation or deprivation or physical exclusion from spaces, but in some ways a more dangerous and tragic impact of this is the mental consequence of it, and how for the black man, and here Fanon is writing about himself, for the black man, the white gaze has a dehumanizing impact. And I'll stay for some more time on Fanon and discuss a little bit the omissions and blind spots in Fanon's work from a feminist perspective before moving on to Bessie Head's novel. So several feminist thinkers have identified and thought about the implications of something that is clear as day, that will be clear as day to anyone who reads even, I think, a sentence or a paragraph from Black Skin, White Masks, which is that Fanon's understanding of the psychological nature of racism, as well as the psychological nature of the resistance to racism, both of these things sometimes appear to be trapped within the bodily experience of masculinity. And Fanon sometimes attempts to go beyond this bodily experience of masculinity, but to a great extent, and definitely Black Skin, White Masks, his early and famous book, remains trapped within the limits of masculinity. In his later works, to some extent in The Wretched of the Earth and more clearly in A Dying Colonialism, Fanon moves beyond this, and Fanon is able to theorize the meanings of race as well as resistance to racism in terms that describe experiences, or that assume the existence of experiences other than those of men. But even that is very limited. So what exactly is the problem, and how have scholars attempted to theorize it? The problem is articulated in chapters in Black Skin, White Masks, and they have to do with the way Fanon describes sexuality. For Fanon, the sexuality of Black people becomes immediately problematic and is reflective of the larger structures of racism. So because societies are structured in a way that whiteness appears superior and also more desirable, this desirability of whiteness is something that Black people internalize. Now, while it should be uniformly problematic for all Black people to universalize the desirability of Blackness, it is not so in the way that Fanon describes the way this desirability of whiteness is found in the sexuality of Black men and Black women. For Fanon, the Black woman who desires a white man in some ways is more problematic, more tragic, more pathologized than the corresponding event or the corresponding problem in a black man, which is the desire of the black man for a white woman. Now, in both of these cases, Fanon works with the pathological idea of sexuality. That is to say, for Fanon, these white objects of desire function as means for the black subjects to remake themselves. That is to say, for a black man who is emasculated by the white supremacist society around him, sexual domination of a white woman offers a way of remaking himself or compensating for that lack or loss within him. This structure of emasculation followed by domination and compensation does not apply in the same way to the theorization of the black woman's sexuality. In Fanon's understanding in Black Skin, White Masks, the black woman remains more pathologized and without recourse to the same means of compensation and remaking or reparation that are available to the black man. So this is the problem. Several scholars have noticed this and have had a variety of responses to this. The most sympathetic thing that one can possibly say about Fanon is that Fanon was not writing in a prescriptive mode, but merely in a descriptive mode. For Fanon, in the way that Martinican and French colonial societies were structured, there really was no escape. And it was in that claustrophobia of not seeing an alternative that Fanon wrote in this extremely pessimistic and cynical manner. This certainly is the position that Lewis R. Gordon takes. Lewis R. Gordon is a philosopher of Africana philosophy, and among the most articulate and well-known interpreters of Fanon's work. Gordon published this book, What Fanon Said. It remains, in my view, the best introduction to Fanon's work, as well as the most balanced and representative analysis and survey of the omissions and blind spots in Fanon's work. So the description of black sexuality and the pathologization of sexuality in the context of anti-black racism. For this, there is no excuse and there is no defense other than the fact that in an atmosphere of extreme oppression, this sort of cynicism found its way into philosophical thinking. But the problem is actually further and deeper than that. The writings of Fanon have what can be said to be a structure of misogyny baked into them. This misogyny is not something personal. It's not that, I don't think we have any way of being sure, but it's not something that Fanon would have felt personally, but it emerges and it emanates from a lot of Fanon's writing. What is this structure of misogyny? So the first part of the structure of misogyny is this pathologization of female sexuality and the inability to envision women's roles in revolution as well as the societies that would emerge after revolution and overthrow of anti-black racism. In both of these roles, that is, even while women were taking part in revolution, Fanon finds it difficult to imagine for the female subject as rich an interiority as well as a subjectivity as Fanon is able to imagine for the black male subject. And in some ways, this is ironic, but it's also tragic because Fanon was writing as a contemporary of Simone de Beauvoir, and Fanon is known to have read Simone de Beauvoir and is widely documented to have encountered the work of Simone de Beauvoir. In fact, the chapter in Black Skin, White Masks, the experience of blackness, the fact of blackness, it can be said that this chapter and the way it articulates a very powerful negative ontology of blackness cannot have existed or might have been difficult to imagine without the author having read and thought through Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, which can be said to be a negative ontology of female subjectivity. When I say negative ontology, I mean a series of intellectual, cultural, and literary discourses which have the combined effect of making it appear that one type of human beings secondary and one type of human beings are primary. For Simone de Beauvoir, this is a sort of patriarchal or phallocentric thinking which has been true of Western civilization. That is to say, Western civilization has established a series of binaries in which men or masculine features are primary or the default, whereas women or feminine traits are seen as the opposite or the secondary to. So female and feminine features have relevance and have meaning insofar as male and masculine features have primary meaning and value. So Fanon's theory of the negative ontology of blackness, this is obvious and this has been theorized by many scholars, could not have been imagined without Simone de Beauvoir. And so the fact that Fanon does not cite Simone de Beauvoir even once has been noticed. This is a gap which cannot be understood simply as an oversight and has been theorized by many scholars as having been deliberate on the part of Fanon. So a scholar of that depth and that sophistication could not have simply forgotten or neglected to cite Simone de Beauvoir. So this is the second part of the structure of misogyny, which is my phrase, and I've been using this phrase to make sense of what is problematic or omitted in Frantz Fanon's work. Now, there is something further in Frantz Fanon's work as well, which makes us think about these theories as omitting a very important part of the human experience. That is to say that in Fanon's work, there is little to no theorization of the domestic space and the spaces that created and maintained by the labor of women. Women's labor and women's spaces, these things are not theorized at all. And this again is a startling omission for a thinker of such humanity, depth, and sophistication. One wonders how Fanon's humanity, which encompassed the experience, the minutiae of the psychological existence of the black man, failed to notice this very, very important aspect of human existence. Now, in all of these senses, Bessie Head's novel, A Question of Power, represents a very powerful engagement with Frantz Fanon's work, and not just engagement with, but it can also be said to be a powerful response to Frantz Fanon's theory. It's also very important to read these two thinkers alongside each other because both of them were writing at a time during the decades of the liberation of several African nations in the middle of the 20th century. As I mentioned in my first lecture on Bessie Head, Bessie Head is probably the one novelist whose work represents the historical complexity of the 20th century, and Bessie Head is the one writer whose novel compels us to read the novels by Anglophone women writers from across the 20th century, from across the historical as well as geographical breadths of the 20th century. Because Bessie Head's novel, A Question of Power, is both remarkably historical, public, as well as undeniably and viscerally personal in almost the same breath. Right? So Fanon is seen as a global thinker of Black liberation, Black psychology, of the philosophy and the ontology of blackness. And Bessie Head sheds a very, very poignant light on that philosophy by showing, in some ways, the dark side or what exists in the shadow of such a philosophy, of such an ontology of blackness. In other words, if the black man is entitled to this kind of a philosophy, this kind of a negative ontology of blackness, what is left for the woman to do, whether it is black, white, or colored? Is the woman to be confined to the shadows of this black man's philosophy? That is the question that emerges from the relationships, from the dynamics, from the very, very disturbing dialogues that we find in A Question of Power. Dialogues that are presented as a result of a triangulation. There is a triangle. There are three people. There are two men and there's one woman. The two men are Cello and Dan, and the woman is Elizabeth. The opening pages of A Question of Power, in fact, do not begin with Elizabeth's background. We are not told anything about who Elizabeth is, where she's come from, what she's doing, etc. In fact, if I can find the first sentence of A Question of Power, it's a very strange beginning. The sentence with which the novel begins is, "It seemed almost incidental that he was African. So vast had his inner perceptions grown over the years that he preferred an identification with mankind to an identification with a particular environment. And yet as an African, he seemed to have made one of the most perfect statements, 'I am just anyone.' It was as though his soul was a jigsaw, one more piece being put into place. How often was a learner dependent on his society for his self-evolution," and so on. As these sentences make clear, we are being described an almost Gandhian or a Nelson Mandela type of figure. And while it is not untrue, these universal traits certainly come under a shadow in this novel, because the novel questions what is the meaning and what is the value of such universal kindness and of such spiritual, philosophical virtues if they are not able to make an impact on the lives of those who are suffering. This description is of the man named Cello. Cello and Dan are polar opposites. They are both men, both African men, between whom Elizabeth, in a way, is sort of stretched or is shuttling between and is torn between. Dan is the man Elizabeth was once married to, with whom she has a child, a son, and from whom she has now separated because of the many ways in which he inflicted violence on her. Cello is in some ways the polar opposite of Dan. Cello is not violent at all. Cello is in fact so detached from the culture and physical realities of Africa that he almost appears to be Gandhian. And that in some ways is as meaningless and as fruitless when it comes to helping Elizabeth find a path through the mental conflicts. That both of these positions, both of these extremes, one characterized by physical violence, that is Dan, and the other characterized by universal kindness, that is Cello, both of these positions appear and end up being equally useless. So the novel begins not with Elizabeth, but with masculinity, with an exploration of what one extreme version of masculinity can look and feel like, and how between these two extremes, the protagonist, Elizabeth, is in some ways trapped. So the very beginning of the novel gives us a clue that it is going to go further than one very famous thinker and philosopher of blackness and African liberation was willing to go. That is, Bessie Head takes us further than Frantz Fanon was able to do. So this is one very important area in which we can see a question of power as being connected to and in very powerful dialogue with some of the most important philosophical and political questions of the 20th century, and specifically speaking, the questions of political liberation in Africa. I will now read from two paragraphs, both of which can appear to be uncannily similar, and they will help us understand the place of this novel, A Question of Power, in Bessie Head's personal and intellectual development. So the first passage is from a collection of autobiographical essays titled Woman Alone by Bessie Head. This is Bessie Head describing her own life, an experience that she underwent as a young child. I was called to the office of the principal, a British missionary, who announced curtly, "You're not going back to that woman. She is not your mother." A teacher found me lying prostrate and at the point of collapse under a bush in the school garden. On asking what was the matter, I told her I was about to die, as no one would let me go home to my mother. Thereupon the principal bundled me into her car, and for some strange reason raced straight to the Durban magistrate's court, where a magistrate read something out to me in a quick gabble that I did not hear or understand. But he looked at me accusingly as though I was some criminal and said hostilely, "Your mother was a white woman, do you hear?" On arriving back at the mission, the missionary opened a large file and looked at me with a wild horror and said, "Your mother was insane. If you're not careful, you'll get insane just like your mother. Your mother was a white woman. They had to lock her up as she was having a child by the stable boy who was a native." The lady seemed unaware of the appalling cruelty of her words, but for years and years after that, I harbored a terrible and blind hatred for missionaries and the Christianity which they represented. And once I left the mission, I never set foot in a Christian church again. Now, that's the end of the passage from Woman Alone. Now, in proximity to that, I want to place another passage. This is from page 16 of A Question of Power in my edition, which is the Heinemann African Writers Series edition. In this scene, the principal of a mission school where Elizabeth is a child speaks to Elizabeth in more or less the same words. This is the passage from A Question of Power. "We have a full docket on you. You must be very careful. Your mother was insane. If you're not careful, you'll get insane, just like your mother. Your mother was a white woman. They had to lock her up as she was having a child by the stable boy who was a native." So you can see that the most painful sentence uses the exact same words. And this tells us a lot about what kind of a novel A Question of Power is. There are times when in interviews, Bessie Head has said that Elizabeth is me. So she has admitted it very openly, and it's not a mystery that's left for readers to somehow identify. Bessie Head has declared that she was writing about herself, and that the protagonist, Elizabeth, is going through the exact same trials of existence, of being born colored in a white South African family, and everything else basically that happens. I'll run through these things very shortly. So this is not an autobiographical novel, however. That would be the easy conclusion to draw, that the protagonist, because the protagonist of this novel has so much in common with the author, that through this novel, the novelist is offering an autobiography in a fictional form. That is actually not very accurate, because what we see as happening in this novel is not a recollection of life, but rather a reinterpretation of life, and specifically a means or an attempt to make something of her life which would be different, or which would make it different from what seemed to be predicted. There is a particular fixed narrative that a life like Bessie Head's was was expected to take in the context of her time. And for a woman who was born colored, abandoned by her white South African family, left to be raised by poor colored families, and ultimately left to fend for herself in orphanages and in charity-run missionary schools, Bessie Head was not expected to thrive. She was not expected to succeed. And there was a great deal in Bessie Head's life which repeated the script. That is to say, Bessie Head's life was full of extreme hardship. She was always struggling, always asking for money from people to get by, and never found the kind of stability, settlement, or the kind of comfort that one associates with, or that one expects to be the just rewards after a life of professional toil, professional labor, and widespread public and critical acclaim. So even though Bessie Head became nationally and globally renowned writer, Bessie Head struggled financially and materially till the end of her life. And it was a very short life, precisely because of how remotely the odds were stacked against her. And so, in some ways, we can read A Question of Power both as an attempt to describe what made Bessie Head's life hard, like what were the starting points, what were the conditions that ensured the hardness of this life, but also an attempt to explore possibilities that would take that life into a less difficult direction. And the possibilities or the potential for Bessie Head's life being less difficult, being less trapped in poverty and hardship than it was, these possibilities lay in the areas of service, in the areas of education, and in the areas of agriculture. Bessie Head found stability, or what stability she did find, in a farming and educating community in Botswana. And that's exactly what Elizabeth also does. She learns how people produce crops, how people cultivate arid deserts using water conservation techniques and experimental farming techniques brought to Southern Africa from Western Europe. That is, there are volunteers from England, Denmark, and other European countries. And there, Elizabeth finds a calling for herself, a vocation as a teacher, as a cultivator, as a gardener. So ultimately, these, teaching and gardening, become the way out. And teaching and gardening, I'll end with this note. The celebration of teaching and gardening in A Question of Power can be said to be the most powerful counter to Frantz Fanon's philosophy of blackness and African revolution. In Fanon, the only means for black people, by which Fanon can be said to mean black men, to undo the ontological damage of anti-black racism was revolution and revolutionary violence, like the war in Algeria. Fanon is not able to imagine quiet forms of revolution or quiet revolutions embodied in acts like gardening or teaching. And that's exactly what we find in A Question of Power by Bessie Head. I'll continue this discussion and wrap up our study of Bessie Head in the next lecture. Thank you.